In this module, we're going to gain an understanding of malware and the threat that this poses to any vulnerable systems or networks that we may have. We'll talk about the components that make up malware and several popular types of malware that are commonly seen. Malware is a catch-all term for any piece of malicious software that damages a system. Malicious actions include anything ranging from eavesdropping on data in the form of theft, all the way to severe actions such as deleting a system or denial of service attacks. The term malware often gets confused with the term virus. So just to underscore this, malware is the more general term for essentially the entire category of malicious software. That includes viruses. So a virus is a type of malware. This also includes things like backdoors, keyloggers, spyware, ransomware, and more. When we're classifying something as malware, there are some components we find in common with any type of malware, so let's talk about some of these common components and what they do. First, the malware will have a payload. The payload is the main piece of the malware, containing functionality to steal data or cause damage in some way. The functionality of the payload is entirely dependent upon the author of the malware and their goals, so that could be made strictly for stealing banking information, or that could be just to serve advertisements to the users so that the attacker can cash in on the advertising revenue. There's a wide range of things this can do, again, depending on the attacker's goals that they have in mind. The payload is also commonly referred to as the exploit. The payload or exploit is malicious code or commands that take advantage of the system in some way. Typically, malware will also have something called an obfuscator. To obfuscate means to obscure something or to make it unintelligible. Good network security will also do this, by the way, through encryption. Likewise, encryption is also a way that a malware author can protect the contents of the payload and hide that from antivirus systems. Another term related to the obfuscation function is packer or compression. If you're familiar with things like zip files, you know that these can compress data in a way so that the file size is much smaller. That's the same way that it's used by malware authors. Compressing the malware data makes it much easier to transmit over a network. Even without encryption, the compression function still serves to obfuscate the malware just a bit. That's because when we compress a file, the malicious code will look different from the original code. Commonly today, our advanced antivirus engines have the ability to reverse engineer compressed malware that attempts to enter a system, essentially decompressing it so that it can be examined and deemed safe or not. Persistence measures are also a common component of malware. We've talked about the importance of persistence when we're trying to maintain access to a target, and that's why this is an important component here. If we take Windows as an example, there are certain things that help speed up the boot process, such as Windows services, scheduled tasks, registry entries, and more. All of these locations are enticing targets for malware for that exact reason. It allows the malware to be persistently executed each time the system boots up. Another component we may see is an injector. This is part of the malware that can inject code into other system areas. Typically, this will get injected into other running processes, or maybe into the registry or system files. This again is a method of persistence and of hiding, where the malware is attempting to prevent its removal. One thing specific to a certain type of malware called a Trojan is a downloader, or the ability to download additional malware or malicious code. This is a component of some malware. Once you have infected a system, it's much easier to use an existing internet connection to download initial instructions or even different malware altogether, and that increases your chances of remaining on the system. So we understand some of the main components for malware. Let's talk about potential delivery vectors, or in other words, common ways for malware to enter a system. Although direct contact with a target is fairly rare, it is sometimes possible. In these cases, we could have malware stalled via a removable storage device, such as a flash drive. When DVD-ROM trays were more common than they were today, that was another potential physical delivery means. Again, this is probably one of the lowest threats these days if we have good physical security measures in place. The top suspect for modern problems is the internet. We're all constantly connected and living online, and this creates the potential for so many problems with malware. This can include untrusted websites under the control of an attacker. Visiting a malicious site can cause a situation where you unknowingly install malware on your system. Email attachments is another big vector. Malware can be embedded into most any file type, even those that seem harmless, like Microsoft Word documents or even audio files, video files, and more. And of course, downloading files from an untrusted source is another risk as well. You may download a compromised file with malware bundled inside. Network propagation is another popular vector, particularly on local area networks. I used to see this from time to time when I worked desktop support, particularly with ransomware attacks. A user might install ransomware somehow, either through clicking an email attachment, visiting an unsafe website, or downloading untrusted files, and not only would their system be affected, but that ransomware would propagate and spread throughout the entire local area network to other users in the office. This can happen either wired or wirelessly. And one last place to mention are file sharing services. We've looked at enumerating these services previously in this course, and for good reason. This can be possible over any well-known service port used by file sharing services like FTP, SMB, and others. That's why it's important to first shut down any services which are unneeded, and second, make sure that anything you're using has good protection mechanisms in place, such as strong credential requirements. Advanced persistent threats are one of the most dangerous threats to corporate assets. There are many notable examples of this in recent times, including the Deep Panda attack. This attack affected the U.S. government's Office of Personnel Management, essentially amounting to an ongoing cyber war between the U.S. and China. This particular attack compromised over 4 million U.S. personnel records, and it's suspected that the Secret Service staff information was also stolen. The main characteristic of an advanced persistent threat, or APT for short, is where an attacker gains access in an unauthorized manner and stays there undetected for a long period of time. There are various methods used for this, including but not limited to those that we've discussed previously in this course. It's also notable that, as with any attack, this can be a single individual or an organized team. In fact, the most successful APTs to date have been orchestrated and carried out by teams. Regardless of the method used to perform an APT attack, there are 6 distinct phases that we need to know and be able to identify. First, phase 1 is preparation. Just as we've looked at with our hacking methodology previously, this initial phase is where the target is being defined. Extensive research is put into motion, trying to learn as much about the target as possible in a quiet manner. This happens in a fairly straightforward manner, typically using passive scanning measures and open source intelligence to determine any interesting targets or to identify possible attack vectors. This is also where the attacker would attain the necessary tools for an intrusion attempt, or they would build the tools themselves. Phase 2 is the actual intrusion. The attacker will attempt to gain access to his target network using the previously gathered intelligence and tools that they have obtained. A couple of common methods for this are, first, exploiting any vulnerabilities that were found during the initial scanning phase. They may engage more with the target at this point, using active scanning, attempting to see if they can exploit any weaknesses. If none of those are readily available, then another common method for this is spear phishing. Spear phishing attacks are the same as phishing attacks, except for the fact that they are highly targeted. This can leverage fake websites such as financial institutions, where the attacker has coded those themselves, or it could be a spear phishing email campaign, where legitimate-looking emails have been crafted and selectively sent to enticing targets inside of the organization. This could also use social engineering tactics as well. Again, the methods will vary from attack to attack, but the goal is just to find any way inside that network that's possible. Phase 3 is expansion. This is fairly self-explanatory. They want to obtain as much access as possible to the target. They want to have control of multiple systems or users and to pivot throughout the network. In other words, to move to other devices on the network. Privilege escalation is a very important part of expansion here, particularly vertical privilege escalation. Attackers want to obtain administrator privileges in some way. Again, those tactics will vary for all of this, from social engineering to phishing scams. The reason they are looking for legitimate credentials is that this is an additional method for bypassing detection. If a legitimate user account, particularly an administrator, if they're observed moving throughout the network and logging into various systems, this is much less likely to raise a red flag than if we see a default account that may have been left in place doing this, or even a newly created user account that may be put in place by the attackers. Phase 4 is persistence. We've discussed the importance of this already as well. Whatever methods or tools the attackers put in place, they want to be able to evade security mechanisms like firewalls or IPS. Persistence is the main indicator of an APT. If the attacker is going to effectively and quietly exfiltrate data in an ongoing manner, they obviously need ongoing access to the target. Some tactics here may include installing malware onto devices that are frequently not checked or examined, or maybe considered above suspicion. That could include things like routers or even printers in some cases. Phase 5 is search and exfiltration. This is where the true damage to corporate assets really begins. At this point, the difficult work has already been done, access is gained, and we have persistence. It's likely that before the attack ever happened, during the initial planning phase, the attacker may have outlined the data or type of data that they wanted to obtain. So in this phase, they are actively seeking that out. It could also involve a mass data exportation, where they slowly and quietly exfiltrate everything they can get their hands on. Emails, storage drive data, user accounts, sensitive documents, and more. Common exfiltration tactics include creating an encrypted tunnel between the affected system that they are attacking and their own system, such as a VPN tunnel. This helps to evade security appliances. They might also leverage protocols like FTP to perform this as well, or similar file sharing protocols. Backdoors are also a well-known covert method for bypassing detection. Data may be sent over ports that are not commonly inspected, such as port 53 for DNS as an example. The sixth and final phase is the cleanup. If they've managed to remain undetected throughout the entire attack and everything they want has been exfiltrated, then it's time to remove any evidence of an intrusion and to cover their tracks. We've also talked about some methods for this as well, which apply here. Deleting log files, deleting browser history, deleting any installed code or tools, and so on. It's essential to revert everything just to the way it was found before the attack began, in order to hopefully hide any evidence that they were ever inside. Obviously, if everything was successful, including the cleanup process, then there's no trace that they were there, and there's nothing to stop them from going through this entire process all over again. This time, however, it's going to be much easier and faster because everything is already proven to work. They know the tools and the tactics that they need to use. As for some hallmark characteristics of an APT that you want to look for, let's talk about that. Those would include things like a large number of network logins at odd hours. Maybe those are happening outside of business hours. Anomalies in the network data flow is also an indicator. Maybe you see a spike in outbound traffic through the network, and also any strange activity from unusual geolocations. For example, if you don't have any reason to see a large amount of traffic to Europe, but you are seeing this in your traffic reporting stats, that's certainly an indicator that there could be an issue. Let's talk about the common categories of Trojans here, beginning with remote access Trojans. We also refer to these as backdoor Trojans because these provide backdoor access to a system which provides administrative control. Because the attacker has administrative control over the system, they can do pretty much anything they like. Common tactics include monitoring keystrokes through keyloggers, stealing sensitive data, activating webcams, deleting or altering files, and many more things. Remote access Trojans can be difficult to detect depending on how they are implemented, because they won't show up on a list of running tasks or programs on the device. A famous example of this is the back orifice Trojan, which installed a small server program on the affected device, allowing an attacker to remotely control that system at any time. We also have botnet Trojans. As the name suggests, this has the goal of infecting a large number of devices in order to create an orchestrated group of devices under the control of an attacker, what we refer to as a botnet. In our modern world, most large-scale attacks that are successful actually involve botnets. Various means of social engineering or phishing can be used to install this Trojan, which will work to connect back to the main command and control server, which is under the control of the attacker. Many of these Trojans also have worm-like characteristics, meaning that they are able to self-replicate and to spread themselves to other systems on the same network, even without user interaction on those devices. Service protocol Trojans are designed to take advantage of vulnerable services and their protocols. This could be HTTP, VNC, Telnet, or other popular services. The reason that these are enticing and successful is that by leveraging popular protocols, they have a larger chance of going undetected. ICMP tunneling is one example of this. Many firewalls by default will allow ICMP echo requests to pass through. In other words, a common ping command to test for connectivity. An attacker can use the small data portion inside the ICMP echo request that they are sending to insert Trojan packets, and those may get passed through unexamined. This is what we mean by tunneling. We are essentially using ICMP to tunnel in other information inside of that packet. Security crippling Trojans are another category. We used to see these much more before our security suites became as advanced as they are these days, but they can still be successful in some desktop environments depending on the antivirus system that's in place. These essentially work specifically against security mechanisms like local firewalls or antivirus systems, and they attempt to kill the process completely, or at the very least to disable that. Now, why would we want to do that? Why would that be the only goal of this Trojan? Well, very simply, so that we can get even more Trojans or malware inside. A recent example of this is a Trojan called Ghost Hook. This took advantage of an Intel CPU found in certain systems where the Trojan could be installed at kernel level. This worked against a feature called Windows Patch Guard, which was designed to prevent rootkits previously. By disabling this, Ghost Hook attackers were free to then install rootkits on the Windows kernel. We also have a category called IoT Trojans, or Internet of Things Trojans. Our devices are increasingly connected to the internet, even our everyday household items like light bulbs, security cameras, doorbells, and more. IoT Trojans are specifically crafted to infect IoT devices, and unfortunately, for many of these devices, security just wasn't a part of the initial design process. So that means that they are inherently risky to have on our local network. So gaining access to an IoT device may allow an attacker the ability to pivot to other parts of the same local network. Along these lines, we also have Trojans specifically designed for mobile devices. Almost everyone these days has a mobile computer in their pocket, so there's a huge built-in network of potential here. These Trojans can enter through traditional means like social engineering or phishing attacks, or even through malicious mobile applications. In fact, one particular mobile Trojan was discovered in over 10,000 installations a few years back, and that was installed from the official Google Play Store. We tend to do everything on our mobile devices these days, from banking to business emails, so it's no surprise that our mobile devices would be such a huge target. And the final category I'll mention, probably the most general category, is destructive Trojans. They have no purpose other than to cause harm through file alteration and deletion. The Shaman Trojan, discovered in 2012, has reemerged several times over the years. The design was that after installing as a persistent service in a host, this Trojan would then spread itself across the local network through network shares to other computers. The payload was set to execute at a specific time, and that would erase all of the local files on the computer. Additionally, this Trojan would overwrite the erased files with corrupted random data so that the original files could never be recovered. Let's compare and contrast viruses and worms here. These are important terms that you should be able to differentiate between. Both are subcategories of malware, which we've previously defined. Very simply, the main difference between the two are that viruses cannot self-replicate. They both have intentions of performing harmful actions in the end, but the means through which they spread is the main difference. Again, viruses cannot self-replicate while worms can. Viruses have the need to be concealed. They are often attached to legitimate files, and most commonly, these are executable files. Even if a virus is downloaded or placed on a system that is attached to a file, it still must be interacted with. This is the reason why we see those attached to executable files in this manner. They're hoping that a user will click and interact with the executable file and in turn click and interact with the virus. The virus itself will not be active until a user interacts with it by opening or running the host file to which it is attached. When that host file is executed, then the virus is executed as well. Usually, the host file itself will remain intact and will operate normally. So for example, if this is attached to some sort of installer file for a program, the program installer typically will still run and function normally, and the program will install without any issues. Again, viruses require user interaction, so the main way these are spread is by the host file itself being transferred in some way to another user or another system. That can be through file sharing, over the network, through email attachments, or any other means necessary. Worms, on the other hand, they do not need assistance from a user. In other words, they don't need the host file to be executed or activated in order for them to work. Once a worm has been placed on a system, typically through network interaction or maybe a downloaded file, then that worm has the ability to self-replicate and spread itself over the local network or through an internet connection. As the worm spreads, it will continue to self-replicate, and each additional copy also has the ability to do the same. So this can spread exponentially in a really rapid manner. These aren't nearly as prevalent as they once were because we now know how quickly and easily these can spread. We understand those much better, and our modern security devices do a fairly good job at protecting us from worms, at least from the perspective of those that would propagate to us from the internet or a local area network. Just to outline a few more differences between viruses and worms, where a virus may delete or alter the contents of the local file system or the files in place, worms typically don't alter any system contents. They're simply going to consume system resources like memory and CPU as they're using that to replicate and to spread. Also, worms spread much more rapidly than viruses do based on their ability to self-replicate. And whereas a virus relies on an attached file or executable program to activate itself, a worm can exploit various vulnerabilities in an operating system or application and spread on its own throughout a network. Fileless malware is a unique type of malware that we need to discuss because this uses native, built-in system tools in order to execute an attack. Because of this functionality, these do not require the attacker to install any software or files onto a target system. As you can probably imagine, this makes fileless malware more challenging to detect. This fileless technique is also referred to as living off the land because existing system tools that are installed on the target can be exploited. There's no need to create and install any custom tools in order to deliver an exploit. It should be noted that although the malware doesn't require the installation of software or code in order to launch the attack, sometimes that is necessary in order to gain access to the target itself. This can happen through various means, such as malicious websites, phishing emails, and many other things that we've previously pointed out for delivery methods and vectors. Commonly, many instances of fileless malware will reside in the system's RAM. Since it's not stored in a file or even directly on the machine, fileless malware can inject code straight into the memory, so the malicious content is never on the hard drive at any given time. Other techniques used by fileless malware would include, of course, phishing emails. As opposed to a typical phishing attack, this type of attack would inject code directly into the memory, with the aim of affecting other legitimate system processes. It's also possible for attackers to exploit pre-installed operating system tools where there are vulnerabilities in place. And in fact, we see this specifically with fileless malware quite often in regard to PowerShell. PowerShell has a powerful amount of access in Windows, so this is an enticing target. Legitimate applications may also be exploited with fileless malware, things like Java or Flash as a couple of examples of that. Let's examine the different types of fileless malware now, and we can categorize that in several ways. We have 3 different types that we'll discuss in just a bit, but first we want to classify those by their entry vector, or in other words, how they arrive on the machine. You can see here we have 3 main entry points pointed out. Those can arrive through the regular execution of applications and scripts through injection. They can arrive through compromised hardware, or they can arrive through an exploit. Notice we also have examples of each entry vector inside of the circle. If we're talking about the exploits category of entry, examples that we see here are indicated in those teal colored boxes, and they include things like exe files, Flash, and regular documents like Microsoft Word files as an example. The execution and injection entries are found in the darker green boxes, and these include things like files, macros, disks, and scripts. And the hardware entries are in purple, and they include things like PCI, CPU, USB, BIOS or UEFI, and hypervisors. Now, as for the 3 main types that we can categorize fileless malware under, let's look at those. First, Type 1 is considered the most fully fileless version of malware. That's characterized by the fact that no file activity is required at all. You'll see that one of the vectors for entry in purple under our hardware section and listed as a Type 1 are network cards. So as an example, maybe a target receives malicious traffic packets which can exploit a hardware vulnerability in the motherboard's firmware. This can install a backdoor into the kernel memory itself, meaning that no file or data was written onto the storage drive. In addition to motherboard firmware, this may also hide somewhere maybe like the network card firmware, or in a USB peripheral, or other places. As we've discussed previously, with these types of kernel-level malware, these will remain persistent and reinitialize each time the system gets booted up. These are especially hard to detect because most antivirus software does not inspect firmware. Now, the good news is these attacks are very complex and they're not easy to carry out, and also they're not very reliable, so they're not extremely common these days. Next, we have Type 2, characterized by the fact that no files are written to the disk, but some existing files are used indirectly. This is where we see things like PowerShell used, where a malicious command can be injected for execution. As an example of this, the Posh Spy backdoor discovered in 2015 injected malicious PowerShell code into WMI in Windows, the Windows Management Instrumentation. This is a framework built into every version of Windows since 2000, and it's responsible for controlling processes and querying system information. So this was a method used for persistence. The presence of the malicious PowerShell code in WMI ensures that the malware is in place upon every system start. And with the Posh Spy example that we mentioned, the code that was used created a backdoor into the system during each startup process. And type 3 fileless malware is characterized by the fact that files are required for persistence. So even though this type technically does rely on files to remain persistent, those files are not directly used for attack execution. And that's why we still categorize these as a type of fileless malware. For example, an attacker may embed a Microsoft Excel file with a malicious macro. That macro could be used to inject malicious payloads into the target host. Just to reiterate some common fileless propagation techniques, those can be things like phishing emails, legitimate applications, malicious websites, registry entries, memory injection, or even through lateral network movement. One of the things we might want to do if malware is discovered, or even if we suspect a file to be suspicious, is to analyze the file. This practice sits at the intersection of ethical hacking, network administration, and forensics. So this topic is something that you may never dive completely into. Reverse engineering malware, especially in a static manner, is a very complex and specific practice in and of itself. So although you may never get really deep into this practice, you should still know some of the details about malware analysis for CEH purposes. And we'll also look at some ways that you can do this in a more easy manner. There are a few reasons that this is valuable. First, it allows us to improve our alerting and notifications. If we're able to analyze and better understand how a particular file came to be on our system or on our network, then we can better configure our security devices for protection against such a threat. Also, it allows us to better triage a security event. If the malware has arrived somewhere on our system, we can't be 100% sure that we are completely safe until we're able to analyze the threat and understand its level of severity and the places that may have been impacted. So in other words, it helps us check out specific areas of a system for infection. Generally speaking, we can perform either static malware analysis or dynamic malware analysis. Static analysis means that we are not executing the code of malware in any way. We're simply analyzing and interpreting the underlying code in order to understand the functionality. Again, this is the complex side of malware analysis. On the other hand, we also have dynamic malware analysis, also referred to as behavioral analysis. With dynamic analysis, we do execute the code of the malware in order to observe the behavior. How does it interact with our system? How does it impact the system? What changes are being made by the malware? Is it installing additional files or registry keys? Is it opening ports? And so on. Both of these techniques are helpful, but obviously they differ in the skills needed as well as the tools and the time involved. Generally speaking, for us, if we're testing this out in a lab environment, we may perform malware analysis in a dynamic manner of some sort, unless we are specifically focused on forensics and have that skill set. Now, we will look at some easier ways through web-based tools to perform static analysis as well, but most generally, we may stand up malware in a dynamic manner in a lab environment and simply analyze the behavior when we launch that. So you obviously don't want to try analyzing malware on the same machine that you use every day for work. It's important for us to create a lab environment. So let's talk about some considerations for creating a malware analysis lab environment. The most useful tool for this is going to be virtualization. Whatever physical system you choose to use, you would want to install a hypervisor onto that system. That could be VMware, VirtualBox, or any other option that you choose. That's going to be the environment that we test everything from. The reason being is this will allow us to use multiple operating systems for analysis. After installing a virtual machine tool, you want to create virtual machines onto that, where you can install an operating system. And there are various options for obtaining and installing operating systems, including free evaluation images from vendors like Windows. They offer free evaluation versions of their Windows operating systems, both desktop and server editions. You can also easily find free Linux distributions as well if you're interested in seeing how the malware interacts with Linux-based systems. Additionally, if you want to be really thorough and see results closer to the real-world environment that you may use every day, you can use a disk imaging tool and create a copy of your own system and mirror that onto a virtual machine. Options for this include tools like Macrium Reflect, Paragon, Hard Disk Manager, and other similar tools. There are lots of free options out there for this solution. Next, once you have your VMs up with the appropriate operating system, you want to make sure that you have isolated the network for the VM from that of your physical machine. If you have a physical machine that is not isolated from your virtual network adapter of the VM, then you're at risk of turning the malware loose unintentionally, infecting maybe the underlying physical machine, or even turning that loose onto the public internet. VM solutions have the option to set the virtual network adapter to what is called host-only mode. And that means that the entire VM network is completely contained within the host computer inside the hypervisor. So even if the host computer has internet access, this can isolate that. For the utmost safety, if it's possible, just completely disconnect the host machine from the internet or the local network before analysis, if that's a practical step for you. Along these lines, we also want to ensure that folder sharing is disabled for each VM. VMs have the option of mounting the local folders on the physical host system in many cases, so you definitely don't want to do that. You don't want the malware to have the ability to touch or interact with your own local files on the physical host. Next, install your malware analysis tools if relevant. We'll talk about some resources for this in just a bit, but you want to get those installed and in place, anything that you're going to use for analysis. And finally, you want to copy the malware to the virtual machine for analysis. When we're ready to perform file analysis, let's talk about some options for this. Beginning with static analysis. File fingerprinting is the main way that we can perform this. With fingerprinting, we're taking maybe a suspicious file and we're computing a hash value for that file. This hash value can be used to essentially create a snapshot of the file's contents. As an example of this, here's a program called Hash My Files, which is a Windows-based tool. So we can launch this inside of Windows, and we have the ability to add a particular file to this, or we can add an entire folder structure. So if I just go in here on my hard drive and I choose a file, you can see that this loads up some hash values. We can double click this and expand it and see more stats about this particular file. You can see that we're able to examine hashing information using various algorithms like MD5, SHA-1, and so on. So that's one option for static analysis. Maybe we want to analyze the hash values for a file, we want to record those, and maybe we'll go back later and double check the hash values to see if those have changed. We also have online options as well. And one of the most well-known tools for this is called VirusTotal. You can find that at virustotal.com. Here, we can actually upload a file for analysis if we'd like to do that. So let's give that a try. If we go under the file box, we choose a file, and you can see that it is computing the hash for that file. After I selected it, it checks the hash, and then we are brought to the results page. This is actually checked against over 70 different antivirus scanners. And in the case of URLs, they're also checked against blacklisting services. If we go back to the top and look under our details tab, we can see similar hashing information here as we saw with the local hashing application. And in the case of this file, of course, you can see that no security vendors have flagged this in any way. We see that listed at the top. The score is 0, meaning that this is safe. Now, under our details, we can also grab the hash values from here if we'd like and use that as comparison. If we go back to our main VirusTotal page, other things we have the ability to do is to check a URL. If we run across a suspicious URL, we can pop that in here. We also have a search box. We can search for IP addresses and see if those have been blacklisted. We can search for domains, or we can put in file hash information. So if we've obtained a file hash ourselves using something like Hash My Files, we can search for instances of that hash online. There are numerous online options for static analysis, which are similar to VirusTotal, but this is probably the most widely used. Now, some considerations for dynamic malware analysis. Let's say you decide to execute a suspicious file in your test environment. What are some things you want to do? Well, first, you want to get some baseline information about your host. In other words, what does the system look like currently before we run that file? You may create a system image also so that you have a hard copy of the current state, or you may simply take a snapshot of things using tools that you have. If we jump back into our instance of Windows, let's look at a Windows system as an example. One thing we can do with Windows is we can use a command called netstat. So I can say netstat-an, and this is going to display active connections and listening ports, among other things. The A means we are displaying all active connections, and the N means that we are displaying the addresses numerically. In other words, IP addresses rather than names. And there are, of course, other options for command parameters. This is just a common usage example. So if I hit enter here, you can see our output, and we have lots of information about listening ports, both TCP and UDP. We see all kinds of ports being used, so this would be helpful to examine. You might want to look at this before and after executing a suspicious file to look for any attempts made for communication. Another tool I'll point out is something called Windows Process Monitor. You can see that the current version is 3.86, and if we scroll down, you can get a look at what this looks like. This is essentially a more in-depth version of the process monitor that we see from the task manager in Windows. You can see the vast amount of information available here, including the processes which are running, the associated registry keys, and more. So again, this will be helpful to get a snapshot before and after executing a suspected file that you want to analyze, in order to see exactly what it is doing on the system. Other areas of interest you would want to check with dynamic analysis include your local event log files. This is a good place that can clue you in on anything suspicious. You also want to check for any new startup items in the startup folder to see if anything has been added. And also check your Windows services to see what is set to start automatically. This is also true for Mac OS, which has certain startup items. All of these are additional places that can help identify indicators of compromise. And of course, you can use locally installed antivirus systems for analysis as well, which you can install directly onto the virtual machines. We've taken a survey of many types of malware now, so let's talk about some countermeasures for these. Some of these countermeasures will be more general and found among all types of malware, while others will be specific to a certain type of malware. With Trojans, the main consideration is using trusted sources when we browse or download anything. Because Trojans rely heavily on social engineering tactics and phishing, you want to avoid any email attachments that seem to be a strange file type or from an unknown sender. If we're not sure about the attachment, we can use something like the VirusTotal website that we looked at previously. We can upload the attachment and have that analyzed. We want to avoid untrusted external storage devices as well, such as USB flash drives. Most modern antivirus systems have the ability to scan an external device before it is allowed to be used. So that's a very good feature to have and a good practice to put in place. Speaking of antivirus systems, we want to have good host-based antivirus systems in place that we are keeping up to date with the latest signatures. We also want to make sure our local firewall is enabled as well. Patching the operating system itself and installing updates in a timely manner will also help to harden against Trojans. And we of course want to disable any unused services and ports which Trojans can take advantage of. With backdoors, our modern antivirus systems are generally pretty good at detecting these attempts before they can be implemented. So we want to have a robust local antivirus system in place that has good protection measures. One of the key things that applies here and with all malware is user education. Our users should be instructed and educated about what an unsafe website looks like, or an unsafe email attachment, or a suspicious application. User education is unfortunately one of the most overlooked countermeasures, but this is very valuable to preventing malware. We also want to make sure that for backdoors, we have a good strategy at the network level. This would include network firewalls, anti-malware systems, network monitoring, and intrusion prevention systems. All of these next-generation security devices can help detect and prevent backdoors. We can lump virus and worm countermeasures together here, and we're going to see some similar items that we've already mentioned. Antivirus systems that we regularly update, of course, and additionally, anti-spyware and anti-adware scans are important. Sometimes spyware and adware can make it through a virus scanner, so we should specifically scan for these things on a frequent basis. And in fact, there are lots of free tools out there specifically made for detecting and removing both spyware and adware. Using pop-up blockers in a browser is also important. Interacting with pop-ups are a common vector for viruses and worms. And as with all types, we should educate our users to have an awareness of things like pop-up blockers and spyware. We want them to have an awareness of their online activities and be aware of how they interact with websites and file downloads. Another important step here is regularly performing system backups. Viruses and worms are types of malware which are notorious for causing damage to a system or its files. So you want to be sure that in the case of an infection, in the case that you are damaged, you have the ability to recover from a disaster. And finally, fileless malware countermeasures. This is a more complex type of malware, so it is going to require more complex countermeasures as well. Countermeasures common here, as with other types of malware, are of course OS patching and updating, and that includes application patching and updating as well, local antivirus systems and browser protections, such as disabling automatic plugin downloads in the browser. More specific protections include disabling macros in Microsoft Office products. Macros are a series of commands used to execute automatic tasks inside of Office products. In some cases, these may be necessary depending on the employee's job role, but for the most part, for the general user, these are not going to be necessary. So disabling these will cut off the ability for fileless malware to exploit macros. You should also disable any PDF readers that are installed from being able to run JavaScript automatically, which can be another entry vector. And disabling PowerShell on any systems where that is not needed is also a good practice. Before we close out this particular section, let's walk through some specific solutions for anti-malware software. There are way too many options out there to name all of them, but I do want to point out some of the most effective solutions that we have available and some of the most popular solutions. These are all solutions that are going to act as countermeasures for malware. These tools can be used for prevention and detection, and also for removal of existing malware in some cases. For Trojans, we have Malwarebytes, which offers scanning features to identify and remove Trojan malware. Malwarebytes will dig deep into places like the system registry and other system file locations to detect and remove these infections. Now, we generally think of Malwarebytes as an after-the-fact scanner and removal tool, but they do also have real-time protection as well. That's a recent feature that they've introduced. The next one to mention is a tool called Hitman Pro. Just like Malwarebytes, this is a malware removal tool. It's really small. It's actually under 10 megabytes in size, and it doesn't even get installed as a program. We just download the executable file and we run that. Hitman Pro specifically focuses on malware signatures, which many basic antivirus programs will overlook. It also features behavioral scanning, so that it will attempt to discover malicious behavior even if the file doesn't have a known malware signature. Other Trojan options are numerous, including things like McAfee LiveSafe, Bitdefender, and Symantec, among others. And these range from completely free all the way to paid professional versions. Now, for fileless malware, these are going to be a bit more complex as far as tools go. They can range from desktop protection, tools like Kaspersky's Endpoint Security. We also have things like Trend Micro Smart Protection for endpoints and many others. We also have things like Microsoft Defender that is included inside of the Windows operating system. Now, there are more complex and full feature tools like CrowdStrike's Falcon. This is going to offer endpoint-based security, but unlike the previous categories of tools we've looked at, most of these types of tools are going to have a central point of management. And that's very important if we're looking at this from an enterprise perspective. We don't have the time or the resources to go to every single endpoint and try and run scans periodically or to keep tabs on those. We want a central point of administration. And that's what things like Falcon offers us. They'll have a server somewhere that has the ability to capture and see data from every protected endpoint. And again, there are many other options out there similar that have not been mentioned here. And of course, we don't want to overlook typical antivirus systems as well. Things like Avast. You might be familiar with Avast. It's a very popular desktop version. It has both free and paid versions. Or ClamWin. That's another very free example of this. These two examples lack a central point of management and would have to be specifically ran on each host through interaction. Now, there are, of course, many enterprise solutions as well, and one of those I'll point out is WebRoot. WebRoot endpoint protection does offer a central point of management where you can see stats about every single protected device, you can schedule updates to the virus signatures, and you can initiate scans on a particular host remotely. And of course, again, just like our other tools for Trojans and fileless malware, there are many options for antivirus systems, things like ESET, AVG, and Avira, just to name a few.